Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We will get started now, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function on the left side of your screen and type in any of your questions. If you want to ask a question verbally, you can use the hand raise function, and we will unmute you. I'll now pass it over to our presenters.
All right, thank you, Kate. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining. I see lots of familiar names, not faces in the audience. Great, I really appreciate you joining today. So my name is Mike Kijewski. I'm the co-founder and CEO of MedCrypt. We're here to talk to you today about our understanding of some of the cybersecurity rules that have come out of the FDA in the last couple of months, with particular emphasis on the RTA guidance, the refuse to accept guidance that came out about 2 weeks ago. Wanted to share with you our understanding of what this means for primarily medical device manufacturers or companies building medical devices. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Naomi Schwartz, who works in our services group here at MedCrypt. And Naomi, I think you have some personal background that gives you better ability than average to understand what the FDA has done. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, 6.5 years of time at FDA reviewing cybersecurity for some of the most interoperable devices. It definitely helps me have a vision for where things are going with the appropriations bill and how that will all get enacted in the next 1.5 years.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining. I'm hoping to make this a fairly interactive webinar. I've got just about 10 slides with some bullets here about our current understanding of what the FDA communicated a couple of weeks ago. Naomi and I are going to talk about our understanding of it. But for those of you who are on the webinar, I'd love to have you chime in with your questions via the Q&A panel. You can wait till the end, or you can do it as we go through the slides, whichever works best for you. But definitely think this will be a more exciting webinar if it's a little bit interactive. All right, so Naomi, you're seeing my slides here, right? Awesome. So what happened? In December, Congress passed an Omnibus bill, which, among other things, gave the FDA statutory authority around cybersecurity, a budget to enforce those rules, and a mandate to regularly and proactively communicate changes in cybersecurity policy to medical device manufacturers. And I believe part of that Omnibus bill gave the FDA 90 days or so to communicate a plan for how all of this would roll out in the coming months. And that communication came out, what was it, March 29th, about 2 weeks ago, in the form of a refuse to accept cybersecurity guidance that told device manufacturers, and we'll get into this in detail here in a moment, before October 1st of 2023, the FDA does not intend to issue refuse to accept letters based solely on a device manufacturer's failure to meet the cybersecurity rules. But after October 1st, the FDA assumes that those submitting things to the FDA will have had sufficient time to get up to speed on the cybersecurity rules and will have addressed them in their submissions. So, Naomi, does that sound about right? What's your experience with RTA letters? How does the FDA think about this in general, and then specifically with cybersecurity?
So historically, for refuse to accept, FDA is looking for really gross gaps. Did you fail to identify connectivity in your device? Do you have a special control in your regulation that requires cybersecurity? So not very many manufacturers to date had been seeing refuse to accept on the basis of cybersecurity information, because FDA was not going through a checklist of cybersecurity content. Those were recommendations. With the appropriations bill signed into law in the end of December, and with the 90-day timeline for that to become law, which has now happened, we're at a place where for some devices, so-called cyber devices, it's not a recommendation anymore. There are specific requirements. And what we'll see over the subsequent, not quite 2 years now from when the bill was signed, is a cascading set of activities that FDA has to take. FDA needs to provide some communications by 180 days from signing, and no later than 2 years after the date of enactment of the act, they need to provide updates for the cybersecurity guidance. But some of that may happen faster because FDA is not the only stakeholder here, and medical device manufacturers need to understand expectations. The reviewers need to understand what's expected. So we may see the guidance come out faster than is required by the law, just because it takes away uncertainty and it helps everyone get on the same page for expectations. There are clearly defined timelines for what has to be done. If it gets done faster, that really comes down to whether or not FDA staff have enough time to do what they need to do, and that they can provide clarity.
Awesome, thank you. We've got a couple of anecdotes of our RTA letters we've seen and communications we've seen from the FDA that we'll get into here in a moment or so. But specifically, I believe the Omnibus bill made an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, specifically Section 524B. If you Google Section 524B of the FD&C, if you're like me, it will take you 20 minutes to find the actual text of the amendment. But here is the relevant section of the text from the amendment that talks about cybersecurity. But essentially, it boils down in my mind to four things. Number one, device manufacturers should have a process by which they monitor for vulnerabilities in their medical devices, right? Number two, device manufacturers should be building devices that are secure by design, right? There's language in there that says, collect and maintain such other information as the secretary may, demonstrate a reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness of the cyber device. So ensure that as these devices are designed, cybersecurity considerations are being made, and the regulatory submission provides evidence that the cybersecurity risks of this device have been identified and have been mitigated. Number three, there needs to be a plan to patch, right? It's not acceptable to release a medical device that runs software and has cybersecurity considerations for which you can't patch that device unless there are some very, very special circumstances in place. And then finally, device submissions should include an SBOM. I think specifically the language in the Omnibus bill maybe says cybersecurity bill of materials, a CBOM, as the 2018 guidance does. I believe we've updated that to SBOM, and everything I have heard has been that the final draft of the pre-market guidance will have SBOM, not CBOM. Naomi, does this seem like a good summarization of what the FDA is asking for here as part of the submission?
That's exactly right.
Cool. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. What if, for example, a device's connectivity and what's meant by cyber device? We're going to get into that here in one moment, so hang on to those questions. The refuse to accept guidance, and I broke the paragraph into what I think are the four main clauses here, says FDA generally intends not to issue RTA decisions before October 1st, but instead work collaboratively with sponsors of such submissions as part of the interactive and/or deficiency review process. We've seen that here at MedCrypt. Some of our customers have received communications from the FDA as part of their 510K submissions, asking some very detailed questions about the cybersecurity posture of the device. Anecdotally, a company that we worked with just here in the last 2 or 3 weeks submitted, along with their 510K submission, what would have previously been one of the most detailed cybersecurity sections of their 510K document that I would have seen. And the FDA came back with 2 or 2.5 pages of questions about what they had done that essentially required the device manufacturer to entirely rewrite the cybersecurity section of their submission and go through a couple of processes specifically related to threat modeling and vulnerability scanning that they hadn't previously decided to do. So that's the FDA's plan before October 1st. You're going to get lots of these sorts of questions, maybe not on RTA. The FDA intends to collaborate. Beginning October 1st, 2023, FDA expects that sponsors of such cyber devices will have had sufficient time to prepare pre-market submissions that contain information required by Section 524B of the FD&C Act, and FDA may RTA pre-market submissions that do not. One of the things that I have heard from medical device manufacturers, and specifically product teams inside mid to large medical device manufacturers who've been building a particular device for the past 5 or 6 years, have gone through multiple submissions, is this idea that, well, we got a 510K approval for our device in 2018, and then we got it again in 2020 when we published an update, and then we published an update last year, we got it again, so there's no reason for me to believe that the cybersecurity posture of my device as it is today will not be found to be acceptable by the FDA. It's my understanding that any submissions going to the FDA, starting today and especially after October 1st, will meet a level of security scrutiny that was not common in the past. Does that sound about right, Naomi?
Yeah, there were a number of devices where you had a lot of feedback. There were a number of devices where there were specific special controls in the regulation where you had to have cybersecurity documentation. And for other devices, based on the risk profile, the review teams were regularly asking for information, but typically not refusing to accept. That is going to escalate to any device that meets the definition of cyber device, which we'll get into in a minute, needs to have the information upfront in order to be complete. And for FDA to start the review, they're going to have that information present starting in October. If you come in between now and October and the information is missing, FDA will not refuse to accept you per this guidance, but they're warning you that you're going to have a lot of interactive review and quite possibly a hold letter with a list of deficiencies. FDA has stock deficiencies that they use to ensure consistency in review and to ensure that all reviewers are applying the guidance in a similar fashion, and that all reviews are achieving the same level of scrutiny. That's a question of fairness. It's a question of ensuring training eventually for reviewers, and it's a question of being predictable for manufacturers. But all of this comes back to FDA is going to decide at some point that they don't want to spend all the interactive time telling you what's missing. If it's missing, they're just going to hand it back to you and say, go read the reg, go fill in the blanks, come back to us when you have a complete submission. And that's what's going to happen in October. Between now and then, you're going to get a lot of interactive questions, though, based on those stock deficiencies that they have. They're going to say, I can't find a threat model. I can't find your software bill of materials. We are not able to see what your planning is for patching. And they're going to start asking those questions immediately, but interactively. And, by October, it's going to be a place where you see that inflection. So do we anticipate FDA adjusting or putting out additional guidance on how to better make the submissions to avoid RTA? There is the original pre-market guidance from 2014. The content in there has been expanded upon largely, and there's a lot more detail in the draft guidance from 2022. But right now, if you are trying to prepare your submission to avoid RTA in October, look at the way that the Act was amended, look at the 2014 guidance and make sure you have everything that's in there, and look at that draft guidance and forecast ahead what FDA is likely to be asking for. While it is a draft guidance and therefore not official policy, it is giving you a very good idea of where the final guidance is going to land. And that's, I think, approximately by December of 24 or March of 25, depending on how you read the appropriations bill, 2 years from the date of enactment piece. But I personally suspect that you'll see the final guidance much sooner than that, because FDA reviewers need to know what they're training to. Manufacturers need to know what is expected. Manufacturers need clarity on some of the language in the appropriations bill. So that's really what we're seeing.
I think a lot of the people who are attending the webinar today have worked in product security roles at medical device manufacturers for many years. They've heard lots of communications and talks by members of the FDA explaining things like the guidance is the current thinking of the FDA about how to achieve existing, satisfy existing regulations around safety for medical devices. So in that sense, to say that it's optional isn't really accurate. But I have seen a lot of product teams inside, especially large medical device manufacturers, who maybe haven't heard Dr. Schwartz talk about this topic, who are just downloading a PDF from the FDA website, and right on the front it says, this is non-binding, this is a draft, this isn't a regulation. And I think there are some people who don't spend as much time in medical device cybersecurity as all of us on the call do, who have interpreted that guidance is optional, and that this October 1st, 2023 is a delay of the FDA enforcing some rules. I actually saw a headline of one of the industry trade publications about the RTA guidance saying FDA delays enforcement until October 2023. That's not my interpretation of the situation. I suspect that's not yours, Naomi. And if there's anybody on the call here from the FDA and they disagree, let me know. But my understanding is, how do you avoid getting an RTA letter? You read the most recent draft of the guidance that's there. That's the current thinking of the FDA. You do the things that the FDA recommends there. You document that they've been done. And then you keep an eye out for changes to those guidance documents, either in the form of drafts or final versions. Sound about right?
Yeah, and to that point, while guidance is not policy, it is not regulation, and it is not required, strong recommendations are generally something that, if you fail to follow, are going to lead to a lot more questions, delay your review of your submission, potentially lead to deficiencies, and it's going to be driven by risk management. Now that it is part of the law to include certain cybersecurity documentation for those cyber devices, what you're really looking at is the guidance tells you how, if you're under that reg. If you're not a cyber device, the guidance is still a pretty strong recommendation. But if you don't do it, if you don't follow the guidance, you end up with a long list of questions. Well, why? And why not? And what did you do? And how did you do it? And what was your methodology? A great example is the EMC guidance. For any device that falls under 60601-1-2 and is medical electrical equipment, if you don't follow the guidance, you're going to have lots of questions. If you follow the guidance, but you don't follow the standard, you're going to have lots of questions. If you follow the guidance and the standard and you have a table of contents that says, here's what the guidance says, here's how I did it, here's what the guidance says, here's how I did it, and you map that out, you make it super easy for your reviewer to identify that there are no holes. They know exactly what your methodology is because it's a standard and everyone knows what's in it. And they can very rapidly see that you've accomplished what you were supposed to and your validation is complete. The same is true for cybersecurity, with the exception that standards are a little bit harder to pin down in the area. So yes, it's recommendation, not required, except now for cyber devices by the law. But if you don't do it, you're really asking for a lot more intense scrutiny from FDA reviewers, because they can't follow what you're doing if it's not well structured and if it doesn't follow the guidance. They're going to have to ask you lots of things in order to make sure that they can map each piece of what you have documented to what they've asked for in the guidance. So it's a lot easier for everyone if you just make a table of contents, map out the guidance pieces, map out where you talk about your approach and where your artifacts are, or explain why something does not apply, and just put it right up front and make it really easy on the reviewer, which of course makes it really easy on your team later.
Yeah. One related topic that I've seen come up between you and some of your clients, there are cases where the design attributes of a medical device make it very difficult or impossible to achieve some otherwise reasonable security goal, right? So for example, you shouldn't in general send data in plain text from place to place, but maybe you are a startup medical device manufacturer, you're building an implantable device that has an extremely low power processor, and you can't do cryptography on the data as it travels between the implant and some programmer device. In the past, we've seen device manufacturers just sort of not really talk about the fact that they're sending data in plain text and hope that it gets through the FDA. It seems like a more prudent approach would be to first have a pre-sub meeting with the FDA and raise this topic, like, hey, we're going to submit this device for a 510K. You're going to ask questions about security. You're going to ask about how we're securing data in the transport layer, and just know that it's, it defies the laws of physics in order for us to use cryptography in this case. So we plan to explain that in our submission. We've seen people have very favorable outcomes from conversations with the FDA around things like that. And then documenting in your cybersecurity plan, we did a threat modeling exercise. We found this risk, right? We looked at what the mitigations could be, but there is no mitigation that we can identify that doesn't preclude clinical functionality, and therefore we've deemed this an acceptable risk. I think you're better off documenting that in your submission than you are hoping the FDA doesn't ask the question. Cool. We have used the term cyber device a couple of times. What is a cyber device? I think Dr. Goldman asked this question. So here is the text that you can find in the bill. Includes software validated, installed, or authorized by the sponsor device, has the ability to connect to the internet, and contains any such technological characteristics that can be vulnerable to the cybersecurity threats. If manufacturers are unsure to whether their device is a cyber device, they may contact the FDA. I've seen lots of questions about this, right? Specifically around the use of the word "and." I think there was maybe a prior draft where the word was "or," and now the word is "and." Maybe somebody who went to law school can help me understand fully the disparity, the discrepancy between those two things. But it seems like this is a fairly there's some gray areas here and some areas for interpretation about what really is a cyber device. So I thought maybe what we could do is take a look at a couple of common device architectures and just discuss between you and I, Naomi, whether or not we think that this would satisfy the 3 criteria on the prior slide. So really common one, a Bluetooth-enabled insulin pump attached to a phone app. And that phone app is attached to the cloud. Pretty clear to me that that's a cyber device, right? It's got software. You could imagine a cybersecurity vulnerability, and it is capable of connecting to the internet.
Yeah, that's right. That can connect to the internet is one of the pieces of the act that I think need clarification in the guidance, and it's part of why I suspect that we'll see final guidance sooner than 2 years from now. But when you get into really technical language like that, and we'll get to the end in just a second, there's always questions about how far you can draw inferences from it. Can connect to the internet or has the ability to, does that mean if I have a Wi-Fi chip on board, but I've disabled it, that it still can if somebody maliciously re-engages it? There's lots of room to ask questions about that. The "and" is new because the guidance has those 3 characteristics, but they're ORed. So if you have any one of those 3 characteristics, you should be following the guidance. The law says if you have all 3 of them. I believe that industry was really pressuring FDA to limit the impact of the change in the regulation early on so that people had time to figure out how to work with all of this. And this was maybe some kind of a compromise to get the legislation passed. And if that was the compromise needed, look, it's great because the legislation is really needed. But what the "and" means is, you know, if you have software and you could be vulnerable, which sort of goes with you have software, and you have the ability to connect to the internet, you know, how do you apply that to each of your devices? Bluetooth-enabled insulin pump talking to a phone app, for sure. That's connecting to the internet. And it's possible that you can attack over the internet through the phone app and affect the insulin pump. So right there, for sure, that one is a cyber device.
There's a great question in the Q&A from Lionel Alden. How about a Bluetooth device that isn't able to connect to the internet, but only to a smartphone? Is that a cyber device? And I hear this question brought up in the context of another class of devices. So X-ray imaging systems like a CT scanner, not designed to connect to the internet directly, but they do connect to the hospital's PACS server, right? The picture, the image database inside the hospital. And that PACS server is generally connected to the internet. And if it's not, it's connected to some other computer that is. So it is a little bit of a gray area in the definition of cyber device. Is a device that doesn't directly talk to the internet, but talks to things that talk to the internet a cyber device? What are your thoughts there, Naomi?
If you follow the notion of a chained attack and you have something connected to something connected to something connected to the internet, if there's a weak link in that chain or multiple weak links in that chain, eventually your device can be attacked by that kind of mechanism. FDA hasn't yet spoken on this issue. It's hard to predict exactly where they're going to land on it, but my suspicion is that if part of your system, if you draw your threat model and part of your system includes something that can connect to the internet, you're probably a cyber device, because that's a trust boundary there that is being crossed. And whether you're only communicating data one way back to the cloud, or not, you have to validate that that is protected in the way that you need it to be to ensure that nothing downstream is affected by that. So it's not just, let's see whether or not we can split hairs with the law. It's really look at the risks that are relevant to your system because of the way that different components are connected to each other and possibly to the internet.
Another example here, a surgical robot not attached to any other IT system. So it's not attached to a PACS, but it is a collection of 10 computers that all talk to each other on a local network inside a hospital. And maybe one of those computers supports like DICOM traffic or HL7 or FHIR to an EMR to talk to Epic. Is that thing a cyber device? I don't know, what do you think?
If somebody could walk in and connect to a port and connect it to a router and it can be connected to the internet, you're in a situation where you're going to have to explain why it's not connecting to the internet. If you have all your ports blocked and you physically cannot access any of them, and the only connections that you have are, known cabling and known configurations, and you have really clear instruction about how it's supposed to be connected, and you have some kind of software mechanism that says, hey, wow, I'm seeing activity that I'm not supposed to, maybe you can argue that that's not connected. But if there's a possibility of any one of those endpoints being connected to the internet, you're going to have some real questions asked about why it's not connected to the internet. It really comes down to, can somebody engage in a remote attack on your device because some aspect of it is connected? Excellent
segue. And this is an example that I have recent personal experience with. Surgical robot, not connected to any other IT systems. It's a single endpoint. It's one Windows box, but there are software updates that are delivered via USB. So there's no DICOM traffic, no HL7 traffic, not connected to a router, nothing. It's essentially air-gapped, but there are Ethernet ports on the box because it's consumer Windows hardware that is running the system, and software updates are designed to be delivered via USB. I see this as sort of the farthest along the spectrum of the gray area of like, is this thing a cyber device or not? If you're telling me that your Bluetooth-enabled insulin pump isn't a cyber device because it doesn't talk to the internet, the app does, that sounds like the logic's a little shaky maybe. I don't know that I subscribe to that. But I certainly understand why somebody's saying, hey, it's a Windows box, it's air-gapped, there are no Ethernet connections, we blocked the Ethernet ports, it's in a locked case, this thing is not a cyber device. We've seen the FDA ask all of the questions that they would ask to the manufacturer of any three of these other example devices, specifically about how are you securing your software updates, right? There are clearly our cybersecurity concerns here. So I see lots of good questions in the Q&A about, well, what if it does this? What if it does that? If it has an active USB port. Actually, Christopher Goggins, if you read my mind here, that's exactly this example here. I think if I were the head of product security at a device manufacturer who was making any of these devices, I would assume that they are all cyber devices. However, the risks that I identify as part of my threat modeling exercise would likely be different for each of these. And I would likely identify a larger number of risks and would find those risks to be more substantial for device number 1 in this case than device number 4. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, I mean, when FDA provides their final guidance, they're going to give a lot of examples, I'm sure, because if there's one thing we know from past experience, draft guidance that comes out always stimulates questions, and industry always asks for examples. For this particular question, is it a cyber device? Really understanding that matrix, that combination of software, vulnerabilities, and ability to connect to the internet is going to be crucial. But at the end of the day, it's not just about what's in the law now. If your risk management is impacted by the system design, those guidance recommendations are pretty strong, and they're still going to come back and affect you if you fail to document your rationale for these things. So maybe you say, well, it only does USB and it only allows software updates. Can I use the USB to, connect it to something that connects it to the internet? Yeah, okay, so maybe it can still be connected to the internet that way. The different argument to take there is there a risk to my device functioning properly if somebody introduces malware because it has a USB port? We all know that USB devices are one of the primary vectors for physical attacks, right? I walk up to a computer, I plug in a USB drive that I found, out on the quad at my college campus, and suddenly I brought the whole campus network down. That's never happened before, right? Just all the time. Because of that, I would less worry about whether or not that particular device meets the definition of a cyber device and worry more about, did I address risk management for my device? Because I'm still going to get asked questions, because the FDA's recommendations are not just, fluffy desires that come out of nowhere. They're coming out of a set of well understood network signals that FDA has been observing in medical devices in the field. So maybe it is and maybe it isn't a cyber device per the definition. We'll see some clarity in that final guidance. But it's still going to need some information. FDA is not going to look at that and go, oh yeah, no big deal. It's got a USB port, but it's not on the network. Cool. No information needed. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, in the current macroeconomic environment, device manufacturers are being asked to do more with less. Right? I mean, they're very literally being asked to do more as it relates to 510K submissions here around cybersecurity. Budgets have been cut at lots and lots of, if not most, if not all, big companies in the last 12 months. So if you're looking for a way to maximize the probability that your device is approved in a timely fashion and you get to market and you're generating revenue with that new device, but looking to not overspend on the security process because you have finite resources, I would suggest that you not focus on making the argument that your device is not a cyber device. I would suggest focusing on maybe conceding to the fact that it might be a cyber device, but enumerating all of the risks that you do not need to worry about due to the way that your device is configured or designed, right? So yes, my device is a cyber device, but there's only an NFC radio and it only supports this packet and it doesn't deliver therapy and it's diagnostic. Therefore, our concerns are limited to this subset of what we would normally be concerned about if this were a full-fledged connected internet-powered device. Anybody else on the call have any experience with this definition of cyber device, or strong opinions or differences in opinions between what Naomi and I just hypothesized?
And I did answer in the Q&A in the example of an insulin pump that's connected to a phone. The pump isn't connecting, the phone is. The reality is, in all likelihood, the pump is sharing data to the app is sharing data to the cloud. Possibly the app is a pass-through for updating the software on the pump or the firmware on the pump. The phone is a threat vector for attacking that pump. And if it is a personal smartphone that a user is using to control their insulin delivery, first of all, you're delivering a potentially lethal drug. Life-saving, but at the wrong dosage, lethal. Second, that's your personal smartphone. That is the Wild West. There is like zero sanitation going on in there. We have no idea what all is on our phones. We don't know what Easter eggs have been put in there by the manufacturers of the phones themselves and the chip makers. We don't know whether there's special software that has been installed on there to spy on us. Personally, I would not put it past any nation in the world right now to not be trying to, inject their own data capture mechanisms on commercial devices. The phone is not a clean thing to be connecting to a medical device that you're depending on to maintain your health. So when FDA put out special controls for those diabetes diagnostic and therapeutic devices, it was with the knowledge that users really need to have less burden and carry less stuff, less paraphernalia for their therapy. They need convenience, they want discretion, but boy, this is a dangerous thing to be connecting to a smartphone. So there needs to be some set of controls in place. And you need to describe those to FDA so that FDA can look at it and say, yes, yes, maybe not, and definitely no, not adequate, right? That's the purpose of all of this, is to really ensure that your threat modeling is comprehensive and thoughtful, and thereafter all of your controls are in place and adequate for that risk management. So it, even though it's now law, the reason for it, the driver is still that risk management activity. Cool. That phone is definitely connected to the internet, and that pump is definitely indirectly connected through it.
I see a bunch of good questions in here, some of which I'm going to delay until a later slide, only because it relates to something that we directly talk about there. Elgin asks, would you recommend using open source software to encrypt USB if needed? So open source software in general is fine to use. Lots of people use it. Pretty much everybody uses it. That's good. To encrypt the USB, adding some security controls around the USB workflow is definitely a good thing. Whether or not encryption is the right control to use kind of depends on what specific risk you're looking to mitigate there. But the one thing that I'll point out is that in medical devices, as it relates to the FDA's cybersecurity controls, the FDA has said that in general, they are less concerned about data privacy than they are about safe function of the device. And therefore, whether we use encryption or some method to verify the integrity of the data kind of depends on the specific risk. But saying like, hey, we don't have this risk because we encrypt the USBs, probably not a sufficiently detailed explanation of what the risk is that you're controlling for and how you're controlling it. All right, a couple other things here. So a couple suggested areas of focus from me and from the MedCrypt team. If you're a device manufacturer, looking forward to planning to how to respond. Number one, have an SBOM, right? A software bill of materials that describes all of the software that you're using in your medical device, including but not limited to the operating system and any other applications that are installed on the device. It's really important. Have a process to identify vulnerabilities and respond to them. So running a scan of your SBOM before you release your medical device is great. You should do that. But you also need a process by which, if a new vulnerability is found 1 month after the release of your software, you're notified of that, and you have a process by which you determine, does this new vulnerability necessitate an urgent software update? Does it necessitate being addressed in the next planned software update, or is it not relevant to us? You need some process to do that. Don't use unsupported operating systems. We've seen lots of medical device manufacturers be surprised when the FDA tells them, hey, you can't release a medical device in 2023 using Windows NT. It's kind of a joke, but Windows NT specifically. But upgrading an operating system, right, a major version from XP to Windows 11 can be a pretty substantial engineering change. You got lots of stuff to test there. So you don't want to find yourself surprised when you submit to the FDA with an unsupported operating system. Have a documented threat model. We've seen this recently in submissions to the FDA. A threat model that's a table that has 3 lines that says, one threat is somebody could read data they're not supposed to. One is they could change it. One is they could get an admin password. Here's our controls. Probably not a sufficiently detailed threat model. There are great threat model frameworks like Stride out there that you can use, excuse me, to document what the risks are and what you plan to do about them. Excuse me. Have some way to verify firmware and software updates. So this has been a really common source of, I don't know if it's been a source of a formal medical device recall, but lots of thorns in the side of medical device manufacturers not having put in place ways to verify that the software update being applied to a medical device came from a trusted source and hasn't been changed. We see questions about this quite frequently from the FDA. Have some good form of user authentication, right? Don't use hard-coded service passwords that exist on every single medical device. Don't have ways where somebody can easily escalate the privileges of a user. User authentication vulnerabilities are responsible for something like 40 to 50% of all of the vulnerability disclosures we've seen in the last 6 years around medical devices. So definitely an important topic. Don't transmit data in plain text where you don't absolutely have to. Again, the issue here can sometimes be less about the data privacy. In other words, saying, oh, we're not setting a social security number, so we can send it in plain text. The concern tends to be more around data integrity. If the data you're sending in plain text says to deliver 800 units of radiation and somebody changes it to be 1800 units of radiation, that's a big problem. And don't reuse keys, right? So we see lots and lots of device manufacturers implementing cryptography in their devices, but key management is a huge pain, can be a huge pain, and therefore we see companies taking shortcuts that involve key reuse, and this is something that the FDA now asks explicitly about. Naomi, any comments about any of these suggested areas of focus here?
Yeah, so I know a lot of companies are asking about have an SBOM. What exactly does that mean? Do I have to have an SBOM? Do I have to show that SBOM with FDA? Do I have to show that SBOM with my customer? Yes, you have to have an SBOM. You should know what's in your software, in your device. You should be sharing that with FDA. The reg now requires it for cyber devices, but the guidance recommends it for all devices that have those three characteristics, or it has software, or it could have vulnerabilities, or it can be connected to the internet. You should just have an SBOM because you need to be able to monitor for vulnerabilities. Do I have to share it with my customers? That depends, right? It probably doesn't make sense for that to be part of CGM labeling for a continuous glucose monitoring system. The average user doesn't read those user guides particularly thoroughly to begin with. The chances of them actually reading a software bill of materials and actually understanding what to do with that information and ever actually doing anything with that information are pretty low. So, do you give your user an SBOM? It depends. There are times when you're going to be connected to a hospital network where the hospital engineers are going to be asking for that information where, yeah, you should be giving it to them. They may have some kind of vulnerability management system, probably not today, but they may be looking to build one, and they need to ingest software bill of materials for all the devices that they're going to connect so that they can monitor and take things off the network if something pops up. The next time there's an OpenSSL critical vulnerability, they're going to need to be able to react to it, even if 2 days later it's not a critical vulnerability anymore. So, have an SBOM is a big deal, and a lot of companies are still scratching their heads about what does that mean? What does it look like? There's no standard. Those are all big open questions, and it's time for people to engage more actively in helping to refine that and get it necked down. Having a process to identify vulnerabilities. A lot of companies have dozens of devices on the market where they don't even have an SBOM. How are they supposed to manage vulnerabilities? This is an area where companies are going to have to get really smart really fast. Do I think FDA is going to come and crack down on everybody and audit them next week? No. Do I think FDA is going to be very positively encouraging for companies to get out there and start doing this right? Absolutely. There's going to be some growth period where FDA is getting more resources and asking more questions and putting more pressure. But 2 years from now, if you don't have a process for vulnerability management, you're in trouble. 5 years from now, if you're not actually doing that process, you're in trouble. So somebody asked earlier about auditing. Typically if FDA comes in and does an inspection, they're doing a standard quality system type inspection. They may ask to see those processes. And if you don't have them, they may ask you why you don't have them. Are they going in specifically to audit your cybersecurity practices? They may be. I know at least one instance where they did, and they issued a warning letter because of it. So, there's no fuzzy area about whether or not you need to have these processes internally. And now you clearly need to document them and share them with FDA. It should be part of your quality system. Having a documented threat model. That's a pretty important thing, because if you don't understand your system well enough, you can't really determine if your controls are adequate. You need to go back and take a look at the threat modeling section of the pre-market guidance and see what FDA is saying about threats. Why does FDA care about this? Well, because stuff is happening. What are the risks that your system is exposed to? What are the means by which somebody could attack it? What kind of attacker might you be facing? For diabetes devices, for a number of years, the attacker is actually the user. People wanted to accelerate innovation, so they were do-it-yourselfing the artificial pancreas, and that was saving lives. So, you know, there's a trade-off there. But you need to know if there's a vulnerability there, can somebody take advantage of it and attack it? That's your threat. The threat is, you know, somebody is going to break through your front door and steal your valuables, right? Can you make your door more secure? Probably. Can you make it impermeable? Probably not. But there's your threat. You know, do I have a door that can be breached? So you need to have that threat model based on your architecture, and it should be a graphical representation as well as, you know, some kind of a matrix talking through it. Don't reuse keys. Oh boy. I can't tell you the number of times where FDA got information from manufacturers saying, we had an oopsie, you know, we reused keys and that shouldn't have been a problem because they were supposed to be locked down and you're not supposed to be able to access them, but oops, like something broke in our process and now they're accessible. And so if somebody gets the unique key from one device, it's not unique. It's used to generate unique keys, but it's common to all the devices. So now I can break them all. That's bad. That is why FDA recommends uniqueness, because if you have unique keys and one device gets exposed somehow, it doesn't affect all the others. So those are my big ticket items where I really get picky about stuff. Number 7, I'm just going to laugh about it because I came to FDA from DoD, where I was a radar jammer and a radar designer, and the whole point of jamming our systems was to figure out, you know, how are they vulnerable and how can we make them more robust. One of the first things you do when you're doing that kind of signal processing is, you know, demodulate the signal and see what you can learn about the device. If you're transmitting in plain text, I don't need very sophisticated equipment to sit there and read the entire exchange between two components and go, oh, every 5 seconds you send this and every 5 seconds you send back this. I can just hop in the middle and send whatever I feel like. And oops, that's bad. Don't transmit in plain text. You know, FDA talks a lot about data at rest and data in transit. And if your data in transit exposes a whole bunch of things, like you can reverse engineer a lot about that communication protocol, about what data is being shared, about, you know, what data could be risky, and you've really exposed your user and your system.
Yeah, Naomi, one other thing about the SBOM, I frequently hear device manufacturers say, well, we're going to give an SBOM to every hospital. What are they going to do with it? They've got tons of these SBOMs. It's not really actionable. And then I'm giving up my IP. It's a bad idea. The FDA has said, most recently I saw Jessica Wilkerson at the CyberMed Summit talk about the origins of the SBOM requirement. And it was in 2017 when WannaCry was spreading and device manufacturers had a hard time answering the question, which of your devices are running an affected version of Windows? And so the SBOM requirement is as much about ensuring that device manufacturers have the requisite processes internally to respond to vulnerabilities as it is about communicating potential threats to hospitals. So it's equal parts, both internal and external use case. We've only got a couple minutes left here. I just wanted to share a couple of things that we're seeing in device manufacturers who've been working hard around product security out in the field. We've seen product security organizations separate from corporate IT. The sorts of skill sets required for product security have overlap with corporate IT, but frequently are sufficiently different to necessitate a separate group. We've seen product security representatives embedded in R&D teams. So you got a big device manufacturer, lots of product teams. One of the engineers on that team is a security expert and has some dotted line reporting to the product security organization. We've seen specific engineers on R&D teams whose only job is security. I didn't see that before 2018. I'm sure it existed. I didn't see it a lot. So ensuring that some percentage of an R&D team, you know, they're the local cybersecurity experts is important. We see product security features on the roadmap extending many releases in the future, right? So for example, totally hypothetical example here, we were sending data in plain text. We fixed that in this release, but we're using a form of TLS that maybe isn't as robust as we would like. So in the next release, we're going to upgrade the TLS implementation. And the FDA appears to like that, seeing a roadmap that, hey, we got from on a scale of 1 to 10, we got from a 1 to a 6. We think we're good for the next 6 months. But we're going to get from a 6 to an 8. We're going to get from an 8 to a 10 a couple releases from now. And then finally, we've seen security features become an input into hospitals' purchasing requirements. We've seen device manufacturers lose sales ostensibly because their device failed to meet the security requirements of a customer. And you've never seen budget allocated for cybersecurity so quickly as when a capital equipment device manufacturer loses a sale because they're doing something suboptimal from a security perspective. And then finally, just a couple of questions that I think for me remain out in the open organizationally. When selling a medical device, are device manufacturers setting aside some financial provisions for future security work, right? If you are an auto manufacturer, you generally set aside 2 to 3% of your top line revenue, set aside 2 to 3% of the sales price of a vehicle for future warranty expenses on that vehicle. If you're releasing a medical device today and you're going to support it for 5 years and your users are going to use it for 10 years, you're going to have some security expenses in year 7. Where does that money come from? Will R&D budgets increase, or will clinical features be deprioritized? We talked about device manufacturers are being asked to do more with less. There's requirements now that didn't exist a year ago. So where does that money come from? Do the R&D budgets get increased? Is there a new security engineer on every engineering team? Or do we have the same amount of engineering resources and now have to deprioritize a couple of clinical features so that we can stop reusing keys or something? And then finally, as a device manufacturer, as part of your planning, you plan to get your device to market at a certain time, right? I saw a graph the other day where somebody showed our device is going to be to market in January of 2026. Well, there's some non-zero probability that there's a regulatory issue either around clinical data, right? Clinical outcomes data, if you're doing a de novo submission, or now around cybersecurity. If you submit your device to the FDA and they say, we really don't like the way that you handle transport layer security, how do you handle that from a business planning perspective? That really needs to be considered. Great, so that's the end of the material that I had prepared here. A couple of good questions that came in. So Naomi, Ashley Schneider asked a really good one that I don't fully understand, only because I'm not a regulatory expert here, but how does state of the art apply if you have a device that's ongoing, you're sustaining, you need to submit a 510K for a future update?
Yeah, so this goes back to the old spy versus spy cartoons in Mad Magazine, where they're constantly escalating against each other, right? State of the art today is not state of the art in 6 months or a year. So state of the art today is you apply a bunch of best practices based on standards, TIRs, guidances, etc., and you hope that you've built in enough excess capacity, enough wiggle room in your design that 6 months from now, if there's some really significant flaw in some software component, that you can update, that you're using software that's patchable, that is being maintained, or that you can maintain, and that you have the ability, you've got a little extra, RAM, a little extra space on your solid state or whatever kind of drive you've got an ability to update your system in some way, whether it's through a recall and factory updating of the system or through over-the-air updates. You need to have a mechanism to patch if something were to go wrong. If you have a device that is going through a feature life cycle where 2 years from now, you're going to be changing it enough that it crosses that boundary of needs a new 510K, you need to be sustaining your cybersecurity along with all of the other aspects of your system. And you'll need to have updated cybersecurity information that is representative of the new state of the art at that point, or as close to it as you can achieve given when you designed it originally. So you need to have future-proofed designs to an extent. Does that mean that today I should be developing systems as if post-quantum crypto is here and people are going to be attacking, modern crypto algorithms? No, because we don't even know what that looks like yet. We know that some of these post-quantum crypto algorithms have already been, pressed really hard and possibly broken. So it means you just do as well as you can. You justify your approach, you document it, and you understand where the threats could eventually expand and new surfaces could arise. Does FDA expect you to be able to predict the future? No. Is FDA capable of doing that themselves? Again, no. They're really looking for, you know, a best effort, and they're not looking for, you know, a Cadillac. They're not looking for you to over design your system. They're looking for something that's right sized. It's not the bare minimum to be secure today, because that won't work in 3 months. But it's also not, you know, let's lock down absolutely everything and spend ridiculous amounts of money on it, and then nobody can afford the device. That also doesn't help. And that's not their expectation. It wasn't while I was there, and I can't imagine that ever changing.
Ashley and Brandon asked good questions that relate to that. So Ashley said, can you repeat the TLS comment? I think you mentioned documenting a plan to get from one level to the next, for example, 1.2 to 1.3. I was referring more to a situation where in version 1 of your product, you were sending data in plain text. And in version 3 of your product, you want to have a full-blown TLS implementation with real certificates that chain to a root of trust. But for version 2, the thing you're putting out right now, the best you can do is TLS 1.3, but with self-signed certificates. Right, so essentially, TLS 1.3 and 1.2 are both considered to be safe, not deprecated. Using 1.2 is fine, but self-signed certificates in some cases are fine, in other cases don't achieve the goal that you want. So if you were to say to the FDA, hey, in this release, we're using self-signed certs, we know it's not ideal, so in the next release, we're gonna have a full-blown PKI implementation, we've seen the FDA be very receptive in those sorts of situations. So Brandon, that relates to your question as well. If you're able to be transparent with the regulator about, here's the risk that we've identified, here's the control we put in place, here are maybe some of the limitations of that control, and here's how we plan to address it in the future. I don't know that it's a matter of policy at the FDA, but we've seen them be very understanding and want to work with device manufacturers there. Cool. One other question about ISO 27001. Could that assist in FDA requirements? I haven't seen any specific certifications serve as a placeholder for the actual security work that you need to do. The flip side is if you're doing all the right security work and you can get one of those certifications, it doesn't hurt. But I haven't seen anybody be able to say, hey, I would submit to you full-blown documentation about what we're doing for security, but instead I'm just going to send my ISO certification. It kind of doesn't work that way, right? So is it a bad idea? Not at all. But I don't know that it necessarily decreases the total amount of work that you need to do there. Let's see, any other open questions in here? There are a couple of questions in here that are related to things that we said. Maybe we didn't get into them in enough detail. I'll make an attempt to reach out to the individuals who asked the questions, maybe with some more detailed answers here. Anybody else have any questions that we should get to here before we wrap up the webinar? In the meantime, while people are typing their great questions, I'll just get in the mandatory plug here for MedCrypt at the end. Short version is we're a medical device cybersecurity company. We've got some products that can help with some features that the FDA wants to see. We've got some services that can help device manufacturers who are building medical devices and need to have security as part of their design. So I'd love to talk to you about any of these things. In addition, we have an information sharing group called MedISAL that device manufacturers can join, and we share some security relevant information with members of that ISAL as well. We have relationships with both the FDA and HISAC there, so lots of good information sharing. Cool. Well, I really appreciate everybody joining. If you have any other direct questions, please feel free to email us. You can email us at info@medcrypt.com. I believe my email address and Naomi's are somewhere on the calendar invitation as well. We'd love to talk to you all individually. But thanks for joining. Thanks for the great questions, and hope to see all of you soon. Thanks, Naomi.
Bye.
Thanks, Kate.